Aid for trade will be fundamental to our policy approach.
You're watching The World from Below, and that was a clip of Foreign Minister Bishop explaining the relationship between aid and trade under the Abbott government. For this episode, we're speaking with Thulsi Narayanasamy from AidWatch. Thulsi, tell us a bit about the role of big business in aid policy. I'm particularly interested in the Mining for Development initiative.
Yeah, and the Mining for Development initiative is a great example of the role that big business has, or the extent to which Australia is willing to go to support the interests of Australian companies, in this case the extractive industry. So the Mining for Development initiative came about in 2012, and one of the things that happened under this, which I think we found to be the most concerning, was that 9 mining companies were directly funded through the aid program to subsidise their corporate social responsibility programs.
So you mean Australian aid companies funded by the Australian government?
Absolutely, which is quite unprecedented. There was no vetting process for these companies. They largely received that funding as a result of their membership of the newly established Australia Africa Mining Industry Group, or AMIG, and that automatically meant that they were able to access these funds. Now, at least 2 of these mining companies have allegedly been involved in human rights abuses and environmental damage, and have significant campaigns against their mines by local community and national community groups within those countries. And it's extraordinary that the Australian government still felt that they were able to directly fund them. And I think, it's not so much about the amount of funding, because it was sort of capped at $30,000. That funding that they accessed was usually supposed to be reserved for small local groups to access that money through the high commissions, certainly not for Australian mining companies. Yep. And then them being able to co-brand with, a brand, I suppose, that has integrity like the Australian Aid Program, then sends a really dangerous message to people in the community, and I think really demonstrates that Australia's standing on the side of big business instead of the side of affected communities, and that's continued on. And other parts of the Mining for Development initiative, all funded through the aid program, are, for example, bringing people from mineral-rich countries, so Papua New Guinea, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, right across the world, to come and view Australian mining sites. This is prefaced by the fact that Australia is selling themselves as the leader of sustainable mining and ethical mining, which I think certainly our Indigenous communities in Australia would object to, as well as our green groups. And I think it's really dangerous then for them to be coming here, viewing mines, for example, by BHP, Rio Tinto, and seeing them as best practice, totally disregarding what some of these companies have done, as close to home as Papua New Guinea. This is just one aspect of how far they're going to work with big business. In Papua New Guinea, for example, there's really unprecedented access from the business community to talk to government. And I think, the extent to which lobbying groups and companies are able to influence policy is unprecedented, and again has become really normalised. A new aid policy comes up in PNG, the business community are heavily consulted, and not one group in PNG working on the ground is consulted. And so I think that disproportionate kind of listening that's happening on the part of the government is then meaning that the policy is then heavily going to fall in the favour of big business.
I did just want to quickly talk a little bit about corruption then, because you did mention before that, with corruption and tax avoidance, that is some of the big problems that prevent developing countries being able to improve their economic outcomes, let alone their social ones that might flow. To what extent do you think that's also a problem when big businesses involved in aid policies, but perhaps aren't willing to confront their own complicity in corrupt regimes or tax avoidance?
Yeah, it's a really enormous issue, actually. I think tax avoidance, we're happy to see, is something that is slowly kind of becoming something that policymakers and government are responding to. But I think what it's not pushing them to do is then to basically turn a slightly more critical eye on the private sector and the role that they have played. It's one thing to address tax evasion by corporations, which is really important, and it's, a significant amount of money is lost from developing countries as a result of corporate tax avoidance. But what about all of the host of other things that they then need to be turning a critical eye on? I think it's quite problematic to only look at one aspect of poor corporate behaviour and ignore the swathe of other issues that are happening. And similarly, I think with corruption, again, to go back to the case of Papua New Guinea, Australian companies are heavily involved in or businesses are heavily involved in Papua New Guinea. To take the case of special agricultural and business leases, or SABLs, this is a mechanism by which land can be leased for 99 years. It's similar to, companies assume that it's similar to being sold, but it's difficult because it's customary land. But basically, it's a mechanism by which 12% of the entire land mass of Papua New Guinea has been acquired by private companies. A commission of inquiry was done by the government of Papua New Guinea, and the finding of that recently was that of 47 of the leases that were investigated, 44 were fraudulently issued. Now, Australian companies were implicated in that. One in particular, a Queensland-based company, was labelled as fraudulent, and that has not been addressed by the Australian government. The Australian government have admitted that they're aware of these sorts of things. And that's just one example of many of how the Australian government could play a far more proactive role in policing the activities of Australian companies, and they're choosing not to.
Can you tell us, in the couple of minutes we've got left, what kind of reforms you'd like to see to improve the integrity of our aid spending?
I need a couple of hours for that, Thulsi. I think the one reform that we've called for quite some time is to introduce an independent ombudsman for the aid program. Currently, there's very little transparency and accountability for the aid program, and that's been a consistent issue regardless of which government is in power. Having an independent ombudsman would mean that aid effectiveness is consistently looked at. I think the other real need that we have is for a complaints mechanism, which the ombudsman could play. So for communities that are adversely affected by aid programs overseas, they would have a quick complaints mechanism. So in the case of the Cambodia Railways project, where 4,000 families were affected, the really big issue that they were facing was that there was no complaints mechanism. That urgently needs to be put into place to rectify what could come in the future, particularly with an aim for more involvement from the private sector. And speaking of the private sector, I think a lot of reform needs to occur around this area. So NGOs, Australian NGOs that partner with the Australian government for the aid program, undergo a rigorous assessment process for their suitability to engage with the Australian government on a kind of high level. And then for each project that they're involved in, they again undergo vigorous assessment. That does not happen at all for private sector, and we've already suffered the consequences of that, and people, of course, on the ground have suffered the consequences of that, and very little has been done to address that. That really needs to be looked at, and I think really what needs to be remembered by the government and the private sector both is that probably the best move by the Australian government to involve the private sector is to hold them accountable for what their activities are overseas, not to presume that they're going to be the bringers of development, because there's very little evidence for that.
And that's all we have time for on this week's episode of The World From Below. I'd like to thank our guest, Thulsi Narayanasamy. I would also like to thank all our crew and producers and our host, RMI TV. You've been watching The World From Below. Thanks for joining us.